If you are watching whether American institutions can still restrain power, when the stakes turn dangerous, you need to take a moment to process what just happened. What unfolded in Washington was not a policy dispute. It was not partisan theater. It was a live test of whether the constitutional system still knows how to intervene when a president moves faster than the law. One vote, taken in silence, just slammed the brakes on a sitting commander-in-chief. Here is the moment that triggered everything. Early this morning, the United States Senate passed a bipartisan War Powers Resolution. That sentence alone should make you pause. The War Powers Resolution is not symbolic. It is not rhetorical. It is one of the few tools Congress possesses that is designed specifically for moments when lawmakers believe a president has crossed from authority into overreach. The direct target of that resolution was President Donald Trump, now serving his second term after returning to office in January 2025. And the reason was not abstract. It was Caracas. According to official accounts and subsequent briefings, President Trump authorized a sudden military raid into Caracas, Venezuela. The operation resulted in civilian casualties. It ended with the seizure of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and it was carried out without prior congressional authorization. Let me say that again so it lands properly. A United States president launched a unilateral military action inside a foreign capital, caused civilian deaths, captured a sitting head of state, and did so without Congress signing off. This is not normal. The Senate's response came fast, not after weeks of hearings, not after months of leaks. An emergency session was called. Democratic leadership initiated the move, but the shock came from the other side of the aisle. A group of Republican senators broke ranks and supported the resolution. This is where you need to understand the context. The Senate does not reach for war powers lightly. It almost never acts this quickly unless lawmakers believe the executive branch is no longer self-restraining. This kind of institutional reflex only appears when confidence in presidential judgment has collapsed inside the system itself. And that is exactly what the behavior signaled. This was not framed as a disagreement over Venezuela. It was framed implicitly as a failure of internal executive control. Behind closed doors, senators described fear of unchecked military authority, not policy. Disagreement, authority. The resolution immediately activated the War Powers Act of 1973. That law exists for one reason. It was written in the shadow of Vietnam, when Congress concluded that presidents, left alone, would drag the country into wars the public never approved and lawmakers never authorized. The statute forces a choice. Either the president obtains congressional approval for continued military action, or the system begins shutting off oxygen. Funding can be seized, orders can be contested. Legal exposure begins to spread outward from the Oval Office. This is where the system stops debating and starts enforcing. And inside the White House, according to executive branch sources, the reaction was panic, not outrage. Panic. Staffers reportedly scrambled. Communication slowed. Public statements softened. The familiar choreography of loyalty shifted into hedging. According to reports, some White House personnel began distancing themselves from congressional confrontation entirely. That behavioral change matters more than any quote. When an administration believes it still controls the field, it doubles down publicly. When it believes the system may be turning against it, it goes quiet. At the same time, the Republican Party's institutional centers went silent. The office of Mitch McConnell offered no defense. The Republican National Committee issued no statement. No coordinated counter-narrative emerged. Silence in Washington is rarely neutral. It usually means no one wants to own what comes next. This is where the event stops being about Donald Trump and starts becoming about the system reacting to Donald Trump, because the Senate vote did something more consequential than restrict a single operation. It opened a pathway for cascading challenges to presidential authority, a pathway that allows other institutional actors to test whether the president will comply, defy, or attempt to override legal constraints. And each option carries consequences that compound. Compliance freezes a foreign policy agenda. Defiance invites enforcement. Legal challenge escalates the conflict into the courts. None of those paths return the system to equilibrium. This is the initial meaning of the vote, not removal, not impeachment, not collapse, but exposure. Exposure of how quickly confidence can evaporate inside a governing coalition when power moves without permission. And here's the part most people miss. Once Congress demonstrates it is willing to activate a hard constraint on war-making authority, it does not easily deactivate. That posture, every subsequent move by the executive is now interpreted through a lens of suspicion. This is where an incident becomes a pattern risk. The Senate did not just respond to Caracas. It signaled readiness to reassert Article 1 authority more broadly. And that signal did not land only in Washington. It landed in allied capitals, in foreign ministries, in defense planning rooms where credibility is measured not by speeches, but by whether orders survive institutional resistance. This moment did not end with a vote. It began with one, and beneath the surface, mechanisms are already shifting that most of the public has not yet seen. The vote did not fracture along ideology. It fractured along institutional instinct. 5 Republican senators stepped out of formation, and that detail matters more than the number itself. Rand Paul of Kentucky went first, not quietly, not with procedural hedging. He went to the floor and framed the Caracas operation in the bluntest constitutional terms possible. Bombing another nation's capital and kidnapping their leader is an act of war. That sentence was not aimed at Donald Trump personally. It was aimed at the legal threshold the system recognizes as war regardless of who orders it. Pause there. That was a senator from the president's own party, redefining the president's action as war. Inside the Senate record, Susan Collins of Maine followed with a different register, but the same institutional signal. I cannot support unilateral strikes that risk American lives without debate. She said after the vote that line matters because it invoked process, not outcome. Debate is Congress's oxygen. When a senator says it was bypassed, she is accusing the executive of shutting off a co-equal branch. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska did not deliver a headline quote, but her vote carried its own history. She is broken with Republican presidents before, and each time it has been over institutional authority, not party loyalty. Todd Young of Indiana, a senator with national security credentials and intelligence experience, joined without theatrics. That silence was its own indictment. And then there was Josh Hawley of Missouri. This is where the system really noticed. Hawley had been widely seen as aligned with the president's populist wing. His vote signaled not just dissent, but recalculation when a perceived loyalist. Effects on a war powers vote. It tells the system that allegiance has limits. When constitutional exposure rises, the tally came in at 52 to 47, a razor-thin margin. But margins matter less than composition. This was not a Democratic rebuke with Republican noise. This was a bipartisan trigger pulled deliberately. Here is the shift most people miss. Once that vote landed, the White House was no longer dealing with opposition. It was dealing with activated mechanisms. According to internal accounts, President Donald Trump reacted with fury. Reports describe isolation in the Oval Office. Phones were picked up personally. This was not delegated outreach. The president called the defectors himself. Rand Paul reportedly ended his call after roughly 30 seconds. No negotiation, no cooling period. That matters. It suggests the conversation never entered persuasion territory. Susan Collins listened. Sources say she did not concede ground. Listening in, this context is not weakness. It is a refusal to escalate emotionally while holding position institutionally. Josh Hawley's call carried the sharpest edge. According to reports, he was warned that he had just ended his political career. That threat reveals more than anger. It reveals an assumption that party machinery could still discipline. Institutional defection. The vote itself had already disproven that. Shortly after the president went public on social media, he accused the senators of cowardice and declared they were destroying the strength of the United States. This was not messaging aimed at Congress. It was aimed at the base. That distinction matters. When a president speaks to Congress, he uses leverage. When he speaks to supporters, he is seeking insulation. That tells you where he believed the pressure was coming from. Then the conflict moved arenas. The White House filed an emergency motion with the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. The request was straightforward: block enforcement of the War Powers Resolution. The argument was not subtle. Administration lawyers claimed the War Powers Act of 1973 itself violates Article 2 of the Constitution. In